We saw her deck burning. We saw planes tumble into the sea like torn wings of angels. And when the fire reached the bridge, the captain whispered through the smoke, "Yorktown's done for." But he was wrong. May 8, 1942, the Coral Sea boiled with metal and flame. The USS Yorktown took 3 direct hits. One pierced her flight deck clean through. Another detonated deep in her belly, flooding compartments faster than men could run. The third tore open the sky above her, sending burning debris across the deck where pilots still tried to land. The air smelled of cordite and scorched paint, a scent no one would forget. The ocean around her was a graveyard of fuel slicks and drifting wreckage. The radio room flickered with dying light, sparks from frayed wires, static hissing like breath through teeth. "We've lost contact with everyone," the radio man said quietly. "Everyone but Divine Providence." His hands shook over the transmitter, blood from a shrapnel cut dripping onto the dials. Above deck, fire teams fought not for victory, but for minutes. They passed buckets of water hand to hand, some barefoot, some blind from the smoke. When the flames hit the avgas lines, a column of fire roared skyward, bright enough that men on distant destroyers thought the carrier had exploded. By dusk, the Yorktown was listing, her hull scarred black and red. The wounded lay in rows along the hangar deck, their bodies swaying with each slow roll of the sea. Someone began humming a hymn, a sound so soft it almost vanished beneath the crackle of fire. At 1900 hours, Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. Over the radio came fragments of last calls, static-eaten prayers. "Tell Pearl we did what we could," one voice said. "Tell him she went down fighting." And then, silence. From the air, Japanese scouts confirmed what they wanted to believe. The great American carrier was dead. In Tokyo that night, officers raised cups of sake and toasted the cleansing of the Pacific. The report sent to Admiral Yamamoto read, simply, "Enemy carrier Yorktown, destroyed and burning. No survivors observed." But the Pacific had its own memory. Beneath the smoke, the Yorktown refused to sink. Her pumps still groaned. Her generators still coughed out power in fits. 2 destroyers circled her like wolves, unwilling to leave the carcass. The next morning, they threw her a line. Slowly, impossibly, they began to tow her north, back toward Pearl Harbor. On board, the silence was almost sacred. Men moved barefoot through the wreckage, listening to the creak of steel. They said the ship made a sound, not a groan, but something closer to breathing. A machinist later wrote in his diary, "She wasn't dying. She was waiting." When the convoy reached Pearl Harbor, even the harbor pilots didn't believe it. From a distance, she looked like a ghost ship, hull scorched, radar masts twisted, paint blistered from heat. Tugboats pulled her in under the gray morning sky. The dockhands stood in silence, hats in hand. No one spoke. That afternoon, in the operations room, Admiral Chester Nimitz listened as the engineers delivered their verdict. Their charts showed everything: ruptured boilers, mangled elevators, burned-out wiring. The head of repair shook his head. "It's not a repair job," he said. "It's resurrection." A silence fell over the room. Nimitz leaned forward, his hand resting on the table. "How long?" he asked. 3 months, at least," someone replied. "Maybe 4. Nimitz looked through the window at the crippled carrier lying in the harbor, smoke still curling from her scars. Outside, the workers had already started to gather, hundreds of them, still in oil-stained overalls from the night shift. The admiral's jaw tightened. "You don't have 3 months," he said quietly. "You have 3 days." No one laughed. No one argued. In the shipyard that night, the lights burned without rest. Sparks rained like shooting stars as welders cut away twisted plates. Cranes groaned. Hammers fell. Compressors screamed. Men worked until their eyes blurred from salt and smoke. Some slept in the hangar bays, their faces black with soot. Others didn't sleep at all. But that would come later. For now, as the wounded Yorktown lay trembling at her moorings, Pearl Harbor itself seemed to hold its breath. The Pacific was quiet, too quiet, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the enemy celebrated a victory that wasn't real. They believed she was gone. America believed she might never rise again. And yet, deep in the echoing metal of her hull, something stubborn refused to die. When the engineers finally stepped back from their first inspection, they exchanged a glance, tired, dirty, unbelieving. Then one of them wiped his face with a rag, turned to Nimitz, and said 3 words that would change the course of the war. "We can fix it. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel." In Pearl Harbor, the air smelled of burned oil and rusted salt. Even the metals seemed tired, every railing coated with a thin brown film that never washed off. When the Yorktown arrived, tugs eased her into dock number 1 like they were guiding a wounded animal. Her hull groaned against the fenders, and the crowd on the pier, sailors, welders, clerks, fell silent. You could hear the gulls. You could hear the slow hiss of steam escaping through cracked pipes. The ship looked like a corpse. Whole sections of the flight deck were peeled back like skin. A gaping hole yawned through her forward elevator, and the smell, burnt insulation, hydraulic fluid, something sweet and rotten beneath it all, hung over the harbor like a fog. Someone muttered, "She shouldn't be afloat." Inside the Naval Command Post, Admiral Nimitz stood before a wall map of the Pacific. His finger traced the curve of the Midway Atoll. The Japanese fleet was moving again. Reports from intelligence hinted at something big, an operation to finish what Pearl Harbor had begun. The engineers told him the truth. "Sir, Yorktown needs at least 3 months." He looked up from the map. "You have 72 hours. No one laughed. No one blinked. They only nodded and walked out, knowing what those words meant. That the war itself was hanging by a thread of steel and sweat. That night, the docks exploded into light. Floodlamps turned the harbor white as day. Hundreds of men poured onto the carrier, ship fitters, pipe welders, electricians, riveters, machinists, civilians, and sailors together. Some had never seen combat. Some had lost brothers at Coral Sea. None of that mattered. They worked without shifts. They worked without clocks. Food was passed in tin trays down ladders and catwalks. Men ate with one hand and held a wrench with the other. The sound of hammers became the rhythm of survival, a steady, relentless heartbeat echoing across the water. A chief mechanic wrote in his pocket notebook, "This isn't repair. It's resurrection by torque and sweat. We are trying to make a dead thing breathe again." By the second night, the harbor was filled with the smell of ozone and welding smoke. Sparks drifted over the dark water like fireflies. The men's faces shone orange in the light of their torches. They slept in turns, curled on the deck beside the engines they were rebuilding. A sailor from Enterprise came to watch. "You people are insane," he said to a welder. "You think you can sail that wreck?" The welder didn't even look up. "I don't think," he said. "I fix." In the command tower, Nimitz kept returning every few hours. He never raised his voice. He simply walked the decks, spoke to no one, and listened to the sounds of the ship being reborn. Once, near dawn, he touched the steel hull and said softly, "Hold together, old girl. Just hold." Day 2, the boilers coughed back to life. Day 3, the electricians shouted when the lights flickered on across the hangar bay. It was like watching a city wake from a coma. The medical bay was still scorched black from the fires at Coral Sea. One of the surviving medics found a melted surgical clamp on the deck and pocketed it as a keepsake. "Proof she survived," he said. At the same time, halfway across the Pacific, Japanese intelligence sent a confident update to Admiral Yamamoto. Yorktown confirmed destroyed. Enemy carrier strength reduced to 2. Tokyo celebrated. The officers smiled. Even Nagumo, the man who had led Pearl Harbor, believed the Americans were down to their last breath. No one told him the ship they thought dead was breathing again. By the dawn of the 4th day, the harbor workers lined the pier in silence. The repairs were not complete. They couldn't be, but the carrier was afloat, engines humming, radar spinning, flight deck patched and painted. A worker, his face gray with exhaustion, leaned against the railing and whispered, "She's alive." The tugboats released their lines. The Yorktown's horn sounded, a low, ragged note that rolled across the water and into the hills beyond Honolulu. Every man on that dock stopped what he was doing. Some saluted. Others just stood there, watching the ship drift out into the open sea like a ghost returning to the world of the living. In the radio room, an officer logged her departure. USS Yorktown, under own power, outbound for operational deployment. Destination, classified. He paused, pen hovering above the paper, then added a single word in the margin, impossible. Out on the Pacific, the wind was cool and sharp, smelling of rain. The crew moved carefully, feeling their way across the still-scarred deck. Everything creaked. Everything shuddered. But the engines held. The compass held. The ship lived. Below deck, one of the welders, a kid barely 20, sat beside a vent, smoking his last cigarette before lights out. He looked at the patched bulkheads, the fresh paint, the scuffed tools lying in a heap, and said to no one, "If she's going to die again, she'll die standing." No one could know then that in just a few days, she'd sail straight into the heart of the Pacific toward an island called Midway, in a battle that would decide the fate of half the world. On the morning of May 30th, the Yorktown cleared the harbor. The sun broke through the clouds and turned the ocean into a sheet of hammered silver. The crew gathered on deck, silent, as Pearl Harbor disappeared behind them. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They only watched, each man knowing this might be the last time he saw land. By sunset, the ship was gone beyond the horizon, a wounded ghost heading back into war. And as the last line of the harbor log recorded her departure, 3 words stood beside the date, written in pencil, almost as a prayer. She sails again. June 1st, 1942. Northern Pacific. The sea was steel gray and unnaturally calm, the kind of stillness that made sailors uneasy. The Yorktown cut through it at 15 knots, her patched hull whispering with every slow swell. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher stood with a mug of cold coffee, eyes locked on the horizon. The light broke through low clouds, glinting off the water like shards of glass. "If the Japanese find out we're alive," he said quietly, "it'll be the surprise of the year." Below, the crew moved like ghosts, disciplined, silent, steady. The smell of oil and new paint lingered from the rushed repairs at Pearl Harbor. The decks were scarred but clean, the weld seams still warm in places. To anyone looking from a distance, she seemed ready. To the men who'd seen her burning weeks before, she was a miracle barely holding together. At dawn, the Yorktown met her sisters, Enterprise and Hornet, just north of Midway. 3 American carriers in a stretch of ocean that felt endless. Their mission, to defend a speck of coral 2 miles wide, called Midway Atoll. In the intelligence briefings, the officers whispered one name, Operation AF. The Japanese meant to strike Midway, draw out what was left of the U.S. fleet, and crush it for good. But the Americans had cracked their codes. The trap was set. For the men aboard, that didn't feel like strategy. It felt like waiting for something huge and dark to rise from the horizon. That night, the wind stiffened. The sea turned black. In the red glow of the hangar lights, flight crews checked their aircraft. Dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo planes, Wildcats armed and ready. Every noise echoed. A wrench dropped, a fuel hose hissed, someone coughed. Lieutenant Commander Oscar Peterson wrote in his log, "No one talks much tonight. It's too quiet, like the ocean's listening. We all know something's coming, but no one can say when." On the bridge, Fletcher leaned over the chart table. 4 red marks stretched across the map: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. For Japanese carriers. Twice the planes, twice the range. "If we lose here," he said softly, "we lose everything." Far away, Admiral Nagumo stood on the deck of his flagship Akagi, surrounded by the scent of polished teak and fresh paint. His men were confident, almost cheerful. Their briefings said Yorktown was gone. American carrier strength, 2, maybe 1. The Pacific, they thought, was already theirs. But 3,000 miles east, the ship they thought dead was waiting. At 4 a.m., a faint blip appeared on Yorktown's radar, something large, distant, moving northwest. The watch officer frowned, adjusted the dials, then shook his head. "Probably weather," he muttered, but his voice carried uncertainty. Minutes later, the alarm sounded. "All hands to battle stations." The klaxon's cry cut through the ship like a knife. Boots hit the deck, hatches slammed, engines rumbled. The Yorktown came alive in an instant, her hull vibrating as turbines spun up. And then, silence again. The first light of dawn spilled over the sea, turning it silver blue. Nothing moved. No ships, no planes, just the slow pulse of waves against the hull. On the hangar deck, a young pilot named Ensign Robert Miller sat on an overturned crate, writing a letter to his fiancée back in Oregon. "If I don't come back," he wrote, "tell Dad the Yorktown's still afloat. She's ugly as sin, but she's breathing again. Tomorrow I fly. I'm not scared, just waiting to see which side of the coin we get. He folded the letter and handed it to a shipmate. Mail it after, he said, and walked toward his plane. At 6 a.m., the call came from reconnaissance. Enemy sighted. Bearing 320 degrees. Distance 150 miles. Fletcher's jaw tightened. Confirm that. The reply came a few minutes later, the voice barely audible through static. For carriers. Repeat, for carriers. On the bridge, no one moved. A low murmur spread. Some swore under their breath. Others stared at the sea. Fletcher nodded once. Then it's them, he said. Nagumo's fleet. Orders snapped through the intercom. Planes were rolled to the deck. Wings unfolded. Engines roared to life. Men in yellow vests guided aircraft through exhaust and smoke, waving their glowing paddles like conductors in chaos. From above, the Yorktown looked impossibly small, one battered ship against the largest naval armada ever assembled. By 7 a.m., the first squadrons were airborne, climbing into the gray morning sky. Fletcher stood at the rail, watching them vanish into the horizon. Below, the radio room filled with fragments of transmissions, bearing reports, bursts of code, half-finished words swallowed by static. The ocean stretched in all directions, quiet as a held breath. Then, somewhere in that stillness, a Japanese scout pilot spotted movement on the water, flat, gray, steady. He blinked, leaned closer to the scope, rubbed his eyes, and stared again. When he spoke into his radio, his voice shook. Unidentified carriers sighted. Wait. Impossible. It's the Yorktown. At dawn, they saw him. Out of the pale haze, where only empty ocean should have been, a carrier slid into view. Burned, patched, stubbornly alive. One Japanese pilot froze at his sight scope and whispered into the radio. Yorktown, he's back. June 4th, 1942. The Battle of Midway had begun. The sun came up sharp and white, turning the sea into a sheet of glass. Far to the west, Japanese bombers were already diving on Midway Island, their engines howling like saws. They didn't know that 3 American carriers were waiting for them, and that the ghost they thought destroyed was leading the hunt. On Yorktown's deck, the crew moved in silence. Fuel lines hissed. Bomb carts rattled. Men wiped their hands on oily rags, faces pale under the first light. The air smelled of paint and salt and the faint sweetness of aviation fuel. Every movement was exact, practiced. No shouting, no wasted words. In the radio shack, Seaman Harold Dobson wrote the final log entry before the strike. Sea calm. Wind light. The quiet before the break. He looked at his watch, at the motionless line of the horizon, and waited for the sound that always came before death, the sudden rising hum of propellers. By 6 a.m., Yorktown's deck crews were launching the first wave. Engines roared, propellers blurred, and one by one the dauntless dive bombers rose into the blinding sky. The ship trembled with each takeoff. When the last plane lifted, a strange hush fell, a kind of vacuum left by purpose leaving the deck. Lieutenant Commander Oscar Peterson, standing near the catwalk, watched them vanish into the blue. If this is our last run, he said, then let it count. On the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo believed the Americans were finished. His reports said Yorktown was gone. His bombers were already halfway to Midway Island, preparing to erase what was left. When the scout plane called in an enemy carrier, he smiled slightly. Then we sink one more, he said. He didn't ask which. At 8:30 a.m., a pilot's voice crackled through Yorktown's radio. Contact. Multiple carriers. Diving now. Then static. The bridge fell silent. Every man knew what that meant. They were now committed, invisible hands moving pieces neither side could see. By 10 a.m., word came in bursts. 3 Japanese carriers hit, burning. No details, only fragments shouted through static. Kaga burning. Soryu gone. Men grinned through exhaustion and disbelief. One signalman leaned over the bridge railing and saw distant black columns rising into the sky. We hit them, he whispered. But the celebration lasted seconds. Another voice broke through, sharp, urgent, incoming. Bearing 280. Altitude 10,000. Bombers inbound. Every man on the ship felt his stomach drop. All hands to battle stations. The intercom barked. Brace for attack. Boots thundered down ladders. Ammunition boxes slid open. The gunner's eyes stung from the fuel smoke already thick in the air. The first dots appeared in the sunlight. Neat formations glinting silver, growing larger with terrifying calm. On the Japanese frequency, one pilot asked, "Target confirmed. Enterprise?" His leader hesitated, then answered coldly, "Negative. Yorktown." The carrier below was still turning into the wind, still fighting to launch another squadron. At 11:01 a.m., the first bomb fell. It came like gravity itself, a dark streak, a widening whistle, then the white flash that split the sky. The deck lifted, the air vanished, and men were thrown like dolls. A tongue of fire roared through the forward section, swallowing planes, bodies, metal, air. The bridge windows shattered. Paint peeled from the heat. "Fire forward," someone screamed, voice lost in the chaos. Hoses uncoiled. Pumps howled. Fire crews ran bent low through smoke, so thick it felt solid. Salt water sprayed in wild arcs across the deck, mixing with burning oil. One crewman fell, rolled, and kept crawling toward a hose valve. He shouted once, "Keep fighting." A second bomb hit near the island tower. The concussion flattened men where they stood. In the engine room, a valve burst, scalding steam filling the corridor. Chief Engineer Riley slammed it shut with a rag-wrapped hand and bellowed, "Pressure steady. Engines holding." The ship was bleeding smoke, but she was alive. On the bridge, Fletcher wiped soot from his face. "Give me a report," he said calmly. "Deck damaged. Fire under control. Rudder operational. Then keep turning into the wind." The message sent across the fleet minutes later read simply, "Yorktown in action. Damage heavy. Ship afloat." A Japanese pilot, banking for another pass, looked down through the smoke and couldn't believe what he saw. The carrier still moved, steady, defiant, her deck scarred but whole. He keyed the radio, "Target not destroyed. She's still fighting." "Impossible," came the reply. Below, the engineers forced the turbines harder. The vibration deepened, a pulse of life running through the steel bones of the ship. In the hangar bay, men dragged hoses across puddles of fuel, stamping out fires with their boots. The air shimmered with heat and courage and something beyond both, pure refusal. By 11:45 a.m., the flames were dying. Smoke drifted off into the blue. The men stood blackened with soot, eyes wide and white in their faces. One sailor leaned against the railing, chest heaving, and muttered, "She's still with us." From a distance, the Yorktown looked like ruin, her flight deck gouged, her tower burning. But she was moving, still turning toward the wind, readying for whatever came next. And what came next was already on the horizon. The first Japanese bomb had struck Yorktown's deck. But even fire couldn't stop the ghost ship. The fire moved faster than orders. It ran along seams of patched steel, leapt over paint still smelling of turpentine, and tried to claim the ship that refused to die. Foam hissed, hoses thrashed, boots slid through puddles of burning fuel. Men shouted without hearing their own voices. "Hold the line," someone cried. Sparks rained like shooting stars. A hose crew stumbled forward, half blind from smoke, the heat stinging through gloves. The deck pulsed under them like a living thing. Below, in the belly of the ship, engineers fought their own war. Steam, sweat, and steel. Gauges trembled on the edge of red. A chief with blistered hands leaned on a valve. "Keep her breathing," he said quietly. "Don't you quit now." On the bridge, Fletcher's face was streaked black. "Report. Forward fires contained. Engine steady. Then turn into the wind," he said. "We're not done." And somehow, the Yorktown obeyed. She turned, shuddering, bleeding smoke, but alive. Across the fleet, a short message pulsed through the static. "Ship in action. We are alive." For a few minutes, the sea was calm. The fires cooled to smoke, the hoses went quiet, and men leaned against bulkheads, panting. A sailor dipped his hand in the warm seawater on deck and said softly, still moving. In the radio shack, Seaman Dobson added a single line to the log. "Initial fires out. Ship maintains steerage. We hold." But far to the northwest, the Hiryu's pilots were already loading torpedoes. Their reports said an American carrier still lived, the one that was supposed to be gone. Their commander's order was clear. Find her. Finish her. At 12:45 p.m., Yorktown's radar picked up a low, fast blur. The officer's voice was flat. "Torpedo planes inbound. All batteries to starboard. Helm, Bring us into the wind." The men at the guns looked up and saw them, silver dots skimming the sea, coming straight at them. Anti-aircraft fire bloomed black in the sunlight. The gunners held steady, eyes burning, arms locked on the triggers. One Japanese plane exploded in a spray of flame, but the rest kept coming. "Hard right rudder," the helmsman shouted. The carrier heeled, turning with the agility of a ship twice reborn. One torpedo streaked past, detonating harmlessly off the bow. Cheers rose and died in the same breath. The next one hit. The impact came like a hammer from the deep, a sound you didn't hear as much as feel in your ribs. The deck lurched, lights flickered, steel screamed. Water roared in through the torn side. Men went to their knees, then ran, slipping on the tilt that now pulled the world to port. "Pumps online. Seal that hatch. Keep the generators steady." Below, men waded through rising water. Wrenches clanged. Someone shouted a prayer, someone else cursed it. Chief Riley grabbed a flywheel, muscles shaking, forcing the pump to life by hand. The machine caught and growled, spitting back water through the vents. The Yorktown listed hard, then paused. 10 degrees, 9-8. The ship was fighting her way back. On the bridge, Fletcher gripped the railing. "She's holding," someone said. Fletcher only nodded. He didn't smile. Across the Pacific, Japanese pilots radioed home. "Carrier hit. Target sinking." In Tokyo, the words became celebration. "Another dead American ship," they said. "Another victory for the Empire." But out here, on the real ocean, the truth was different. The crew of Yorktown could still feel her heartbeat, the deep vibration of her turbines refusing to die. A radio man tapped out a final report through the static. "Hit by torpedo. Damage heavy. Pumps engaged. Ship afloat." He paused, then added, "Still fighting." By 3 p.m., the fires were out. The sea was calm again, deceptively peaceful. The men leaned on the rail, soot-streaked, exhausted, staring at the horizon where smoke drifted like ghosts. The ship was scarred and silent, but upright. One sailor wiped his face with a burned sleeve and whispered, "While she stands, we stand." No one answered, but every man heard it. And when the wind cleared the smoke, the silhouette of the Yorktown still cut against the light, dark, broken, but unbowed. The reports said she was gone. The ocean said otherwise. She wasn't going to sink. 6 hours after the second strike, Yorktown was still afloat. She leaned slightly to port, scarred and blackened, but standing against the empty blue like a wounded animal that refused to lie down. The battle around Midway was over. 3 Japanese carriers burned on the horizon, their smoke twisting into the clouds. The Hiryu, the last of Nagumo's fleet, was finished too. The Americans had won the fight, but on Yorktown, no one felt victorious. Most of her crew had been ordered off, transferred to nearby destroyers. But a small team, engineers, electricians, volunteers, stayed behind. They called themselves the Afterguard. 50 men trying to save a ship too proud to sink. The air hung heavy with heat and diesel fumes. Patches of oil shimmered on the water, catching the sun like glass. Somewhere below deck, the ship groaned, the slow, rhythmic sound of steel shifting under stress. In the forward compartment, Chief Engineer Riley wiped grease from his eyes and said, "Get the pumps running again." "They won't hold long," a mechanic warned. "They don't need to," Riley answered. "They just need to keep her breathing." By mid-afternoon, the auxiliary pumps thudded back to life. Water sprayed through cracked hoses, but it was progress. The men cheered softly, too tired to make it sound like celebration. From the deck, you could see the destroyer Hammond approaching, small, fast, cutting a clean line through the oily waves. Her crew waved as they came alongside, lines thrown, fenders out. The sea between the two ships shimmered black with fuel. A bosun on Yorktown called down, "Welcome to the madhouse." The answer floated back, "We brought patch kits and bad coffee." By evening, both crews were working shoulder to shoulder, running cables, setting pumps, sealing the wounds below the waterline. Men passed tools hand to hand across the swaying planks that connected the two ships. Every few minutes, the sea slapped the hulls together with a hollow metallic thud. Dobson, the radio man, sat on an overturned crate near the communications mast, writing one more entry in his log. Flooding under control. Hammond alongside. Morale improving. The ship still alive. At dusk, the ocean softened. The wind died, and the Pacific went quiet, too quiet. The waves were small, the color of lead. Somewhere in the distance, a seabird called once and was gone. A young machinist named Keller leaned over the railing, staring down at the calm water. "You think she'll make it?" he asked. Riley stood beside him, his voice low. "She already did the impossible," he said. "What's left to fear?" For the first time in days, they allowed themselves to rest. The deck was littered with tools, coils of rope, burned gloves, the remains of a fight that never seemed to end. Men sat in silence, backs against bulkheads, watching the sunset paint the horizon with faint streaks of red. It was peaceful in a way that felt wrong. Under that still water, something else was moving. Far to the north, the Japanese submarine I-168 had been tracking the carrier for hours, slipping through layers of oil and debris. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been given a single order: finish what the bombers could not. By 1 p.m. on June 6th, I-168 was in position. Her periscope rose once through the oily slick, then dipped again. Through the narrow glass, Tanabe saw two ships locked together, one wounded, one helping. Perfect targets. He ordered silence. The crew moved like shadows. Metal clicked, a slow mechanical heartbeat as the torpedo tubes flooded. Above, on Yorktown, no one saw the periscope. The sea was too calm, the air too still. Riley leaned over the map table, checking pressure readings. "Stable for now," he said. "Maybe she'll hold through the night." Dobson was writing in his log again, his pencil dull from overuse. "Weather calm. Crew fatigued. We're alive. Again." The word "again" was the last thing he wrote. At 1:35 p.m., the ocean beneath them shuddered. The first torpedo struck Hammond amidships. The sound wasn't an explosion at first, more like a deep, distant drumbeat rising through the hull. Then came the shockwave. A column of water shot skyward, fragments of metal and wood raining down like hail. Men on Yorktown's deck froze, staring in disbelief as Hammond split in two. The blast ripped through her fuel lines, sending a burst of flame across the water. Before anyone could react, the second torpedo hit Yorktown herself. It struck low, near the starboard side, a violent, twisting blow that lifted the deck beneath their feet. The sound tore through the ship like a scream. Pipes burst, lights flickered, and the pumps that had fought so hard to save her finally went silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the roar of escaping air, the hiss of steam, and the sea rushing in. Then the silence returned, heavier than before, final. June 7th, 1942. The morning broke over a quiet ocean. No gunfire, no smoke, just a long gray horizon and the slow roll of waves that didn't care who had won. The Yorktown was dying. She listed sharply to port now, her hull torn open by the torpedo that had struck the day before. The Hammond was gone, her wreckage scattered like driftwood, and oil from both ships spread across the water in rainbow streaks. The smell of it clung to everything: metal, clothing, skin. On the destroyer bulge, the men stood along the rail, watching the wounded carrier drift. The ocean was still, except for the hiss of small fires burning out on the surface of the slick. Every few seconds, the ship gave a long, hollow groan, a sound like a living thing trying to breathe. Commander Buckmaster was among the last to leave her. His clothes were soaked with oil, his face blackened by smoke. He looked back once from the small boat carrying him away and whispered to no one in particular, "Easy, old girl. You've done enough." By 9 a.m., the Yorktown had rolled even farther. Her once straight deck was half underwater, the island tower leaning like a tree in a storm. Beneath the surface, bubbles rose, slow, steady, endless. The engineers still aboard until the last possible moment had fought to keep her stable, but it was over. There were no explosions this time. No screams. Just the quiet crack of tearing metal as compartments gave way, one by one. The sound carried across the sea, echoing like a low bell. From the nearby destroyers, hundreds of men watched in silence. They had spent days saving her, fighting for every minute of buoyancy, every heartbeat of steel. Now they could only stand and witness. At 10 a.m., the list increased suddenly. The water rushed over the deck, swallowing the markings, the bullet holes, the footprints. The air filled with the smell of rust and oil. Someone murmured, "She's going." No one moved. No one spoke. The Yorktown hung for a moment, balanced between sea and sky, then rolled slowly onto her side. The sound it made was not thunder but something softer, deeper, like the sigh of a tired giant. Water poured into her open hangars. Air escaped in huge, glistening bursts, rising to the surface like final breaths. Her bow lifted slightly, then slid down. The flag still flew from the mast as it touched the water, folding against the waves before disappearing. It took 7 minutes. When it was done, the sea closed over her gently, leaving only a wide circle of oil and the faint debris of a ship that had already died twice before. The men on the destroyer stayed at attention long after she was gone. Hats in hands, faces blank. The silence felt heavier than grief, a mix of awe and disbelief. They had watched something greater than a ship go down. They had watched courage itself sink beneath the waves. Commander Buckmaster broke the quiet first. "She did more than we had any right to ask," he said. His voice was calm, almost distant. Then he turned away. The last bubbles surfaced, then faded. The Pacific was calm again. That afternoon, a message was transmitted to Pearl Harbor. USS Yorktown lost following torpedo attack. Crew evacuated. Conducted herself with extraordinary endurance. Admiral Nimitz received the report in silence. He stood at the window of his office, the late light glinting off the water beyond the harbor. "She gave us Midway," he said quietly. "She gave us everything." Out at sea, the destroyers circled the spot where she had gone down. The oil still spread in slow, mesmerizing spirals. A single life raft drifted through it, empty. A sailor tossed a wreath of palm leaves into the slick. It floated for a while, then turned over and sank. Night fell clean and cold. The wind picked up, scattering the last thin smoke from the horizon. Somewhere under that vast expanse of ocean, 3 miles down, the Yorktown settled into the dark. Her decks filled with silt, her hulls went quiet. But the steel still held its shape, as if even the sea respected her stubbornness. Days later, pilots returning from Midway still looked for her, an outline against the water, a shadow on the horizon. One wrote in his journal, "Sometimes I think I see her wake, just for a second. Maybe that's just the mind playing tricks. Or maybe some ships don't vanish. Maybe they keep sailing somewhere you can't follow." The official records would call it a loss. History would call it a turning point. Because by the time the Yorktown slipped beneath the waves, Japan had lost the war it thought it was winning. The balance had shifted, quietly, irrevocably, on the back of a ship that should have died in the Coral Sea, but refused. She was dead twice and came back to change the war. And as the Pacific swallowed her, the world tilted toward victory.